Hello and welcome to our next Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition webinar. Today we have, the topic is dealing with grief, loss, and transitions in a correctional setting. And our presenters are Catalina Connealy-Salazar. Catalina has a lot of experience working in the California correctional system, one of my former colleagues here. And she now volunteers at the DC jail. She does grief counseling at a Maryland pre-release center and also coordinates a grief support group for adults dealing with the loss of a parent. Our other presenter is Deacon Schwartz. He works for Catholic Charities. He manages in DC. He manages the ministries of Prince George's and Howard County detention centers. And he's also the prison ministry coordinator for the Archdiocese of Washington, DC. So welcome, Catalina and Chris. We're great. I really appreciate your taking the time to share with us your experience and your ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start us off today, and I'm going to actually just have 20 seconds of silence, just so I can center myself and we all can just be fully present here. We are living in a time when the dual contagions of COVID-19 and racism have brought us into uncharted terrain. We are all hurting and grieving right now. The losses are many, both personally and communally, locally, and worldwide. Our pastoral work inside correctional facilities is always challenging, but even more so in these times. We may not be able to go in for a while, but when we do, we will encounter people who are despairing, angry, and perhaps numb, having had to live through these current times with inadequate medical care, being locked down, and unable to stay in close contact with family and friends. And we need to be there to listen. At the heart of being a companion for those who are grieving is coming in with an open heart and mind, willing to listen and receive their story, and to let them know they are not alone. Deacon Chris and I hope that what we present here today will help you in your ministries in real and concrete ways. Whether you are a paid staff or a volunteer, we know that what you do and have access to is often limited. Nonetheless, there is still a lot we can do. We ask you to listen with an open mind as we present. And if you don't have the space or the resources that we're talking about, still think about how you might modify some of these suggestions to make it work at your location. Remember that everything that we are presenting today are things that we have done personally in a correctional institution. One caveat, we know we are not counselors. However, for some of the people that we serve, they may never have been to counseling, nor will they ever go. Most likely, we may be their only professional contact in the realm of psycho-spiritual issues. So we function more like spiritual directors, asking open-ended questions and to get them to talk and share their story and the pain that they carry. Then with our words, our presence, and our prayers, we offer balm for the wounds. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Deacon Chris to start defining the terms that we'll be using today.
So basically what we're talking about here is we start by making a distinction between grief and mourning. Grief is a term that refers to our thoughts and feelings. It's an inside thing. Mourning is something different. Mourning is an outward expression of our grief. Grief upends us, it disorients us, and it opens up spaces within our hearts. The pain of grief has a lot to teach us. Grief renders us vulnerable. And to heal our grief, we must express it. That is, we must mourn. We must mourn our grief. And if we don't do that, we'll carry our grief into the future and it will undermine our happiness and undermine everything that we do for the rest of our lives. Grief brings us an invitation to spiritual growth. You know, pain is one of the fastest routes to a no-frills encounter with the holy. And that's just from Barbara Brown Taylor. So, Catalina.
So what we want to do is just talk about the background for some generalizations that we can assume that the people we're serving are coming to us with the following: multiple losses throughout their lifetime and multiple traumas, with the distinction being that losses are what we need and feel from sadness. The traumas are fear-based. And so the people that who are coming to us, even if it's just with my grandmother passed away, there's a lot of other losses that they've experienced and may never have grieved. They often had no support or no access to support systems. They have losses they buried, losses that have then become sadness, depression, anger, aggression, and eventually led them to criminal activity. So some of these losses are not named, they're suppressed, they're not even recognized that they are a loss, and therefore they're not healed. We know that many times growing up, young men hear the message, man up, suck it up, deal with it. Many of the people we serve are coming to us having held so many losses, and therefore they have only destructive and dysfunctional coping strategies. So now we're going to talk a little bit also about things that our clients bring very specifically. What are we talking about when we say they come with traumas and losses? Well, they've grown up with violence around the home and in their community. They've often experienced a lot of death, abandonment, possibly by a parent or a parent figure. And abandonment can be anything from the father wasn't in the home to he was in prison to mom was an alcoholic to whatever. There's been often abuse, physical, emotional, sexual. I was a teacher before I became a chaplain working in corrections. Most of the students I worked with had either been suspended or expelled from school at one time. Oftentimes, starting in the second grade, they'd be acting out behavior, but all of it was due to what was going on at home and the inability to have a way to express their feelings over the sadness of what they were living with. Many of our clients have grown up in poverty. They have family members who have suffered poor health, and so they've witnessed people in and out of the hospital and on medication and limited access to get the care they need. They may have had friends or family members diagnosed with a terminal illness, and they're carrying that around. Some of our people have lacked permanent housing, everything from somebody being homeless to even some of the youth that I used to work with, where there were several families living in one home. Recently, a friend of mine who teaches in a poor section in California told me that when she was doing the online learning with her student, he was living out of a laundry room with his mother, literally, because that's all they could afford in a house that was divvied up with various families. And finally, some of the people we serve have little or intermittent experience with the religious community. They may have had a parent or grandparent teach them a little bit about faith, or they may have gone to church for a short time, but not with any true regularity.
The death of a family member or a friend through illness or accident or violence, and violence is one of the biggies, because if you're in jail, there's probably something that's happened that's you've been associated with. You've watched someone. I had one inmate who told me about watching as his brother had a gun put to his head and the trigger was pulled. That type of stuff you don't get over easily. Addiction, of course, is a biggie, and that's either within the household or personal addiction. Abortion, murder, betrayal. I had a young man named Bob who his older sister, who was 18 at the time, started abusing him when he was 12. He told me, and it really took a while for him to get around to telling me. It was about a year after we first met that he started opening up to me. He said, you know, I was 12 and my older sister was 18, and she taught me what sex was. And, you know, at first he said, I felt it was pretty cool. But then he developed this aversion to anyone touching him, which ended up with him killing somebody. And that's how he found his way into jail. Rejection, lack of support from the family members. I was thinking about this one of shame. Shame cuts several directions, and Elizabeth was a wonderful RCIA teacher, a religion teacher that I had in the women's prison up in Jessup. I had started that program, and she stepped up, and she was one of our best teachers. And you know, at the women's prison, volunteer chaplains like myself and also visitors would just show up and go through a line together. Well, I managed to get in line just behind Elizabeth's parents, and they told me about how they didn't do anything wrong, and yet they're being shamed. They're being treated like criminals. And of course, that's the way security works in jail. Going into jail, if you look at it, is like going to prison. And they just complained and complained and complained. That was the last time that they ever saw their daughter. It's just, shame cuts so many ways. Loss of a job. Well, let's face it. You go to jail, you lose everything. You lose first thing that happens if you own a business. If you are lucky enough to be that successful, it's in foreclosure very quickly. And your wife, she gets tired of waiting for you. And who wants to go out with a person who's a convict in jail? And of course, as I go to the jail, I find out that 85% of the people are awaiting trial, sometimes for 1, 2, 3 years. And during that time, whatever they had on the outside is gone. It's separated. And there is a lot of mourning that has to be done. So the divorce and the loss of job, loss of business, losses that one cannot even publicly declare because of the fact that of the shame involved. And then, of course, the feeling of abandonment, that you can't even go to your mother's funeral. So that sort of ends what I had to say about these things. The next is, let's see if I can find it.
And what I'll just say is, so that's a sampling. There's obviously more things, but we can just make the assumption that the people who come to us for one issue are carrying many, many issues around grief and loss. And so first and foremost, people need to tell their story. That is the number one way people heal, grieve. And our duty is to listen and love. We have to listen, support, validate feelings without any judgment. When they tell us things that we find unbelievable, when we hear things that we can never even imagine and things that they've done, we have to have no judgment. We just listen. And we want people to talk and express freely, so we ask open-ended questions. Tell me about your grandmother. Tell me about your father. What was he like? What's a memory you have? How are you feeling now? How did you feel when you were with that family member that you love so much? Telling our story makes it holy because it brings to the light of day what we're feeling and experiencing. And we, as the compassionate listeners, can help people see how God has been present all along with them, pointing out those points of light when they felt maybe they were alone. But we may hear in the story how God was there supporting them. It also allows it to just be transformed. And so their lives become sacred text. It's not just some horrible things that happened that I never want to speak about again, and I just want to pretend it didn't happen. No, even those horrible things are part of our life story. They are part of who we are as human beings and what God has given us and what we need to live through. Those experiences as well can be sacred text. We help the person name the layers of losses. So when a young man comes to me and says his mom died, well, his mom left him at 5 when she was an alcoholic, was in and out of his life. So he's mourning the mom that he wished he had had. He's mourning the mother he did have, and he's mourning the mother that he will never have in the future. So those are layers in there that we have to understand, that there's different parts in the grief process. Sometimes we're going to hear stories where someone says, you know, this person died and the last time I talked to them, we argued. And I'm mad at them because they allowed something to happen to me or they did something to me. When it's appropriate, we want to encourage that they try to forgive the person that they've had the issue with. Our role is there as one of empowerment to help people own their stories and bring it to light and know that through God's lens, it's all for good. God will turn all things to good. And some of the losses and problems and issues that people have carried can then help them in their future when they go on and they might want to become a counselor or become a support person or what have you. Everything can be used in God's hands.
And there are ways that we can sort of open up people because, you know, a lot of people have been suppressed for so long that they really aren't that anxious, like Bob, who I talked to for almost a year before he explained to me how he managed to get himself into prison. We have to give grief a shape and a form in words and in images. And one that I sort of think about is the idea of the grief body. This is like a spirit that comes, an evil spirit that comes and lives in us. And we don't have control over ourselves because this grief body is just taking us over. And the idea of, as I sort of looked for images of how that might appear, I sort of came up with this one. It's a pernicious spirit that comes into our body and takes over. It changes our life, our way of looking at things, and how we look at ourselves. And of course, it's really amazing how the inmates can be so creative in defining what their grief looks like. And you get some images that are really amazing. And then there are other techniques that we use, such as poetry. Oftentimes, you know, defining things in smell. What does grief smell like? What does this smell like? They can't tell you much of the other stuff, but they can tell you what their grief smells like. They can tell you what it tastes like. This idea of 6-word stories is a really powerful one because it means you can just write 6 words that tell what your grief is about. When you do this sort of thing, especially in a group setting, you can get people to talk as where if you say, tell me what your grief is like, you're never going to hear it. Now, gratitude lists. This is something, it's not that. Gratitude lists are things that help us honor our past. And of course, I will tell you that as Catholics, we always take up collections. We always have a collection in our service. And one of the ways that we honor what people are thankful for is at the beginning of the service, we hand out a form that says, what are you thankful for? And then at collection time, we take those up. And of course, one of the other things that I often talk about is the idea of centering prayer. Centering prayer is something that works for everybody, and it's as simple as a breath. I often would start a session by saying, what do you want more than anything? And the answer that I often get is, I just want to be able to sleep. And the honest to God truth is that centering prayer in a certain way can be used for that because it quiets the mind and allows people to get some sleep. And of course, here's a little handout from Prison Contemplative Fellowship in Folsom, California. And this is just one panel of an 8-panel handout that I often give out. So those are things that we do to get people to think about what it is their grief is. And here's another one that Catalina is going to talk about.
Right. And I just want to mention in the chat box, we threw in some journal questions. I wasn't able to get it into a handout in time before the webinar started. So we put the journal questions in the chat box that are writing prompts to enable people to write about their grief when they're not with you. And then maybe later when they're comfortable or if they want to, they can share that in a one-to-one pastoral setting. So a mandala is a circle. It's a Hindu form of encapsulating the universe. It symbolizes wholeness. And what you can do with that is, since a lot of our inmates can't get to the chapel, they can't get out of their cell or cell block for a variety of reasons, we want them to be able to feel like there's some sacredness in the space that they're in. And by having them draw a circle, a mandala symbol to represent God holding us in a circle, and God's encircling arms. And then inside of that circle, they can put thoughts, feelings, images, symbols, whatever they need to pour out and keep in a sacred, safe space. So it's like I say, bringing church to them, bringing an altar to them that they can just create right there and write it in a journal, or maybe put it on a paper they can put up on their wall in their room, what have you. But at least it creates a space of sacredness for them. Then we'll go on to the next. So Capacitar is an organization that started 15 years ago after Hurricane Katrina by a former nun. She wanted to get techniques into the hands of people who were suffering emotionally and grieving. And so we have the website in our bibliography. And if you go to it, you'll find some techniques such as meditation, breath work, acupressure, that can help people physically with the embodiment of their grief. And I'll give you an example, what's called the finger holds. So the belief is that in each of our fingers, there are different feelings that are held there. And by holding our fingers for 3 to 5 minutes each with some deep breathing, we can help relax those. For example, the thumb is grief, tears, and emotional pain. The middle finger is anger, rage, and resentment. This one is lack of self-esteem and feeling like a victim. So simply holding the finger, breathing slowly for 3 to 5 minutes is a way of releasing that energy and relaxing. So something simple. You don't need any other tool or technique. You can just do it with them right there. Music is a wonderful way to help people emote and get feelings up. A song I used quite a bit at the correctional facility where I worked with youth who are between 14 and 24 years of age. The song I Can Only Imagine by Mercy Me. I was fortunate to have a chapel to myself that I could use, a Catholic chapel. So I could bring the youth in and go into the chapel and put on music and let it play and repeat and let the tears come and let them just feel the solace and the comfort of being in the presence of God. Another song is Dancing with the Angels. There are many, many songs out there, but if you have access to a way to play music for people, that is very helpful. You can ask them, what's the song that you associate with your loved one? And maybe you can play it for them. I was also fortunate that I had a volunteer who knew how to drum with individual drums, and she purchased some, and we created a drumming circle. And I used that, starting with the young men that most needed a way to release pain. One young man's father had died while he was locked up. His father was literally, this is almost unbelievable, was rolled in a gurney into the correctional facility, into our health unit. And the young man came up to say his goodbye because the father was days from dying, and they allowed that to happen. But after that, you know, it was wonderful that I got to do that. But after that, it was, how does he now process that he has just lost his father? Won't be able to go to the funeral. And so he was in the drumming circle. So we would have different spiritual themes. We would do some scripture reading, and then we would allow the young men to go to the drums and just play on them and play whatever they were feeling or thinking. It's a great way to release energy. I was also fortunate that I had a little garden right outside my office, and so we could plant flowers and trees in memory of people's loved ones. Or you could offer to do that at your church. If there's a little plot you could set aside and say, we're going to plant this little seed or tree, whatever you can do to feel like somebody is giving tribute, something tangible that can be done for them. Anniversaries are a huge trigger for people. So you might get a call that so-and-so's acting up, and you'll find out after you talk to them, it's because it's the anniversary, the birthday of their loved one. Not only did they were they able to grieve properly, now they're getting triggers. And so like with the young women I worked with, they would act out or cut on themselves, become suicidal on the anniversary of their parents' death or on the anniversary of their birthday. So one year I simply said to this one young woman, why don't we just have a birthday party for your mom? Tell me what kind of cake she liked, and you can come up, invite some of your friends. Why don't you make a poster, a tribute to her? We'll sing happy birthday, and we'll just celebrate. And her whole demeanor changed. And it was a day that instead of her being in isolation because she was trying to self-mutilate, she instead had a birthday party for her mom and appreciated it and celebrated it and honored her. And it didn't take much on my part to create this for her. But it could be something as simple as singing their loved one happy birthday. When they say, today would have been my mom's, whatever, 58th birthday, you say, well, let's sing her happy birthday, you know? Just, or again, ask the question. So tell me more about your mom and tell me what she used to do on her birthday. Just trying to normalize all of the feelings that continually come up because of triggers and anniversaries. And the last one is body movement through yoga. We have some websites that you can go to. David Kessler is a renowned grief speaker, and he has a video on grief yoga. Even if you were to take one yoga pose, one stretch pose that maybe opened up the heart, that you could do at the beginning of a service that you were leading, or at the end of a prayer that you gave, or any way that you can find ways to incorporate these various techniques, even if it's only one little part of it, would be helpful for people.
Now, as we were saying, until you mourn, which means sharing your grief with someone else, you just don't really have the ability to unload yourself. So we memorialize the loss. And here are a few ways of doing that. One is by making holy cards. And this particular example that I'm giving here is one that was done by a young man, and the Knights of Malta picked it up, and they also had an inmate write a prayer to put on the other side. And this is a holy card that I pass out quite frequently. And this is the sort of thing. I mean, the idea, this is pretty detailed, but there isn't any reason why you couldn't do something considerably less complicated than this. And just, you know, on a blank 3x5 card would be a good place to do it. And it reminds you of what your loss is and what you're missing. Rosary cards. Now, this is something that I've often encouraged the inmates to do. And the deal that we end up having is, you know, you want to have a rosary club, you got to have rosaries. And inevitably what happens is that the warden or the director says, look, you can't use those things because people can choke other inmates. So then I went and got the breakaway beads, you know, that can't be pulled without breaking. And they said, oh, no, they're using those for poker chips. I said, well, they're using them, I don't mind. But having rosary among a group of men where they remember what they are praying for at the beginning of each prayer service, they would talk about, and what they could use, and this is one of the ones that I use. These are inexpensive. They're like 25 cents a piece, and I can buy lots of them. They're really laminated cardboard. And I tried getting the solid plastic ones, which last a lot longer, but evidently the you know, inmates are very clever, and they were using them to jimmy the locks in the jail. So this is what we've ended up with, and it seems to work pretty well. Now, the book of names at church. I have a prayer group at my parish church who prays over prayers that men write, or men or women. And honestly, it's the same thing as I mentioned before, where we take up a collection. And then the next one below that is a teaching centering prayer. And of course, we've already discussed that a bit.
Okay, and I just want to touch back on the writing the names down. Like if you're on the go and someone comes to you and said, can you say a prayer for my loved one? And you do. And then you say, would you like me to put their name in my church prayer list? So you would ask permission. And if so, just knowing that someone else is going to pray for their loved one would bring great comfort. Just even if you don't have a prayer group to give it to, I know we all have in the churches a list of the sick or the list of the deceased, and just telling them that you're going to be able to write it down at a church where it's going to be, that person will be prayed for, is going to be very meaningful. So a wall of remembrance. This came about because in 2011, I lost both my parents 3 months apart, and I was working at the facility and deeply in grief, wanting to remember them, feel close to them. And I had a chapel office with a window that looked right into the chapel. And I wanted their presence close somehow. I wanted a remembrance. And I decided to bring in the little pamphlets with their picture on it that we had used at their funerals. And I got a bulletin board and I put them on there. And then I had two of the inmates, one who was good at lettering, write the words wall of remembrance, and someone else who drew angels for us, and we cut them out. And then I opened the invitation to all of those who attended service. If anyone had a loved one, a picture of a loved one, which they often do, who had died, and they wanted to put that person's picture up, they were welcome to do so. And then if they didn't have a picture, we used index cards, and I would get colored index cards. And I think that's important, just so they could choose a color that was meaningful to them. And then they would write the person's name and maybe a tribute, and I would have stickers, being a former teacher, and they would decorate it with little stickers. And that may sound very juvenile, but I guarantee you it would work with adults as well. Anything that you could do special for the name of the loved one and then put it up on a sacred space. And if you don't have a chapel where you can do that, how about the chapel office? Or they can maybe just put it up in their own cell room. But just a way of saying, I want to remember my loved one. I'm going to put their name down. I'm going to put their picture, and I'm going to put it in this sacred space. So that was our wall of remembrance. And it became one of the most special places in the chapel that people were immediately drawn to. I would have a battery operated candle there. And when a new person came in, when I get the call that someone lost a loved one, right after we would talk together, I would offer them, would you like to have their name on the wall? And sometimes they weren't ready. Sometimes they're too numb when they first get the information and when they receive the fact that their loved one has died. So you wait until they are ready. And then you say, at any time you want to add someone, the wall's there to give remembrance. And then that leads into, again, for those who can't come to the chapel, maybe making their own little mini shrine or mini altar in their room. Again, you can use the mandala or just on a sheet of paper, a shoebox, when you're allowed to bring things like that in. And they can cut out images from a magazine and glue them on, or drawing images, but something where they can have a special place to honor their loved one. Memorial services, if you're a chaplain, to provide memorial services for those who can't attend the services of their loved one, and making it special by having the inmate help plan the service. What songs would you like to use? What was one of the favorite scripture passages of your loved one? Have the inmate write the eulogy that they get to then present. I was fortunate that sometimes I could bring family members in. So when we did that, it was just the family and the inmate, and I would do the service for them. But sometimes when the family wasn't able to make it or wasn't around, the inmate would invite friends, and then I would have a group of inmates, up to 10 people, and we would do a memorial service for that one individual, but it really became a communal memorial service because everyone in that room had someone they knew pass away who they couldn't honor and couldn't attend their service. And so it really became a communal grieving time. And it was wonderful that they had a safe space to do that. Providing scripture passages, go through the book of Psalms and Lamentations that provide comfort, or even ones that provide the lamenting, the crying out loud, because there's a time in the grief before we get to soothing and consoling where people just need to cry, they need to talk about it, they need to ache, they need to call out to God. So allow them to lament. Give them some of the passages where the psalmist cries out to God. And I believe I have addressed the last two. So.
Okay. And I think that before we go on, one of the things that we really need to do when we are acting as chaplains or volunteer chaplains in a jail or prison is to help them form a community. Because they need that support. They need whatever they can. And I can tell you, the men can be very violent to each other. Ordinarily, even good people that seem like they really love God. And then the next thing you know, they're in segregation because they have punched somebody out. But the idea of bringing a community get together, and when those men sit around a table and they start their rosary by saying, what are we praying for today? And then the men see the vulnerability in each other. And then the community starts to form. Now, this last slide that I have before we get to questions are just, what do you do when someone comes up to you? And this is on the go, in the moment. And quite frequently, this happens either before services start, or somebody, you're on your way out and 3 people that didn't make it to services show up in the hallway and they say, oh, could we receive communion and can you say a prayer for us? This is the type of thing that you want to be ready to help and get them together. Prayers, when you give them to people, are very important. And I often, if I can, do this thing where I put my hands on the head of the person that I'm praying for, or if not the head, on the shoulders. And honestly, when we get into a prayer service together with, multiple inmates, and I'll say, this person really needs our support today. Everybody just sort of stretching their hand out towards that person to show their support for them is a tremendous comfort. So when someone approaches you, you ask for what is it they would like you to pray for? The name of perhaps they have someone who died. What is the name of the person? Using that name in a prayer, you say the prayer while using either hands on the shoulders or on the head. And then you ask them if you can have your church group, like my prayer group at my parish, pray for that person. And then you give them a holy card, similar to the one that I showed from the Knights of Malta, and perhaps encourage them. Say, look, this was made by an inmate just like you. Why don't you try to come up with something, even if it's stick figures with a prayer? Or one of the things that I've done that's really, I have like a group of 5 or 6 general purpose scripture passages, and I just, keep them in my back pocket. And I pull one out and I'll say, here's Psalm 23, and this is how this applies to you. And please, after we leave today, recite this and remember that I'm praying it for you as well. So I think I'm about ready to shut this slideshow down, and we can go to Q&A, right?
Well, why don't you just hold for just a sec? So first, somebody has asked if they can get a copy of the slideshow. So this whole webinar is going to be on the website, so you can go back to it any time. But there was another question I saw that someone said, these are great ideas, but now that we're not able to go in, what can we do besides praying? And I would say prepare. You've just been given a lot of ideas, some you may have never seen or heard of. Go back, look at this webinar again, look at the resources we provided, the websites, read up more on grief, get prepared so that when you go back in, you are ready with scripture passages and other techniques that we've mentioned here today that you might be able to use. So use this as a time of preparation, because we will be going back in and there will be a lot of hurt and pain that needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. And I just have some closing thoughts as well. You might want to consider, I kind of said, putting a list together so that when you're coming down the row and someone comes to the office, you can give them some of these suggestions in a handout possibly. Most likely, they won't be able to do much the first time they receive news of a passing of a loved one. And most likely, the first thing they're just going to need is that safe space to let the tears flow. But if you're able to see the person again, then you might be able to delve into some of these techniques either with them, or they can do it on their own and come back and share with you what they've done. The bottom line is that in all the suggestions you are giving, these are all avenues for people to tell their story, talk about their pain, so that healing may occur. And I have a poem I want to read, and it's in the resource that I gave you. It's from the book called The Cure for Sorrow by Jan Richardson. That's the title of the book and the title of the poem. And it says, "Because I do not know any medicine for grief, but to let ourselves grieve. Because I do not know any cure for sorrow, but to let ourselves sorrow. Because I do not know any remedy, but to let the heart break, let it fall open, then to let it fall open still more. Because I do not know how to mend the unmendable, unfixable, unhealable wound that keeps finding itself healed as we tend it, as we follow the line of it, as we let it lead us on the path it knows. because I do not know any solace, but to give ourselves into the love and hold on, just went where my notes go. Because I do not know any solace, but to give ourselves into the love that will never cease to find us, that will never lose its hold on us, that will never abandon us to the sorrow for which it holds the cure. So I thank you all for your time and listening. We do have our emails in the bibliography as well if you want to talk further questions. It wasn't me. Okay, so somebody wrote about the capacitar techniques sound like Eastern religions. Again, a former nun put together the capacitar techniques, and all they are is breathing exercises, exercises for releasing emotion. This isn't about a religion question. This is not about Eastern, Western. This is about something that if you find helpful for people to use, to move energy through, use it. If you're not comfortable, then don't use it.
That's a great point. Thank you both for a superb presentation. My experience certainly over the years has, what you're saying is absolutely true. And I think the follow-up with people grieving, when you're first notifying people in the prison setting or the jail setting about a loss, they're going to be in shock, they're going to be numb. So it's always really important to, as you were saying, to follow up, give them an hour or two to kind of process and then go back and see them. Making sure they're in a safe place. And then after they've had a chance to kind of absorb the information, then they can, you can help them with the grief. When people are first told, as we know from our experience, there's kind of a denial process, there's a shutdown, emotional, and they just need to get through that. And they kind of have to do that on their own. So thank you for that. Another issue I've noticed a bit of buzz on, about in the chat about rosaries. You know, after 27 years in prison ministry, if I never gave out another rosary, I'd be perfectly happy. Which is not to say, I think the rosary is a wonderful prayer. It's extremely important for prisoners to pray it. But often they become a commodity within the prison. It's jail jewelry. People who don't have any idea what they are want to wear them for various reasons, often nefarious. So I think the idea of using the laminated cards is really wonderful. Autumn is one company that produces them. Any Catholic supply company would have something like that. And again, there's something that don't become contraband within the prison. They don't become status. They don't become something that's tradable or reusable as hair beads or poker chips, as you were saying. Because those things really denigrate our faith and they denigrate what the rosary is all about. So it's not like handing out rosaries is the most important thing we can do as chaplains. We need to forget that. Encouraging the prayer of the rosary is important, but we don't need the physical beads to do it, and often they're problematic. So thank you for raising that. I think it's something we really need to look at and deal with responsibly as chaplains.
And I just want to piggyback on something that Chris had said about, you know, what sometimes these people who you think are one way and then all of a sudden, you know, something happens and you find out what they've done. Oftentimes when I was working with the youth in particular, and if they were to get news that they did not want to hear, no matter what I did, they went back to their unit and they picked a fight with either an enemy or a staff member. That was the only way they knew how to process their grief. So you need to be prepared for that. And knowing that a lot of fights out there have some kind of grief and pain just below the surface. And, you know, I just think it's a topic that's always present when we're talking to people, and that we need to be sensitive to and aware of that someone is hurting and therefore they're acting out.
That's a great point. And the other thing I would add to that is anytime we're dealing with issues around grief, it doesn't have to be an immediate loss that you're notifying somebody. You can be in a group and the topic of loss comes up. My experience working mostly with men is that a lot of the men they act out their grief through anger. That's the only way they've learned how to do it. And they're comfortable with that. So often men will, if you've been discussing grief in the service or in a group, they'll end up in the hole in a couple of days and you'll wonder, oh, I wonder what happened. Well, it's because we brought up some things and we didn't find a way to contain it. So be very sensitive around, especially men inmates, although I imagine it's true for many women too, but especially men. They need a way to safely contain these feelings, and otherwise they may act out, as you're saying, Catalina, and end up getting in trouble and getting disciplinary reports, which we don't want for them.
And I think something else I just recalled too. So when, let's just say you have to bring up the grief, and now you got to go. You've got the next thing, or they all of a sudden they're on whatever, they got to move them out. You always want to leave people with some hope. So part of those, let's say scriptures even, is not just lamentation, but it's also give them a line of hope, whether it be like you're going to pray for them or do something, because you can't just open up the wound and just say, I'm really sorry, I'll see you next week when I make my rounds. You've got to leave something for them to hold on to. And sometimes they're hopeless. They're hopeless for so many reasons. So we as the pastoral presence bring in the hope with our traditions, with scripture, with our presence. So always, always hold the hope while you're holding the pain, and help them to see both.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I don't see any additional questions at this point that need to be addressed. Do you?
I don't see any right now, but feel free, if you're one of our participants, to add any comments now while we still have some time. Also, of course, this video is being recorded and will be posted on the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition website as soon as possible, so you can always come back and review the material. Chris, anything that you want to add?
No, I think I'm good. I just wish my phone had been turned off before we started. I apologize for that. I think that all of us who work in prison ministry have, we learn as much from being prison ministers as we teach or we share with others, so that the idea of going into jail is always, for me, exciting, because of the things that I'm going to learn today. And sometimes these are things that are going to help me in my own life. And sometimes it's not what the inmate says, it's what the inmate challenges me to start thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
So all of you who are involved in prison ministry, thank you so much for your ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you who are out there doing this.
Yes.
We need more people with compassionate hearts and understanding hearts. Absolutely.
And just as we began, as Catalina began, commenting on sort of the viruses of COVID and racism that we're dealing with as a culture, as a church, we're in a particularly intense time of grief right now. And I've been able to go into the prison the last couple months since I'm a staff member, and the guys are locked down and they're extremely nervous and stressed, and it kind of comes in waves, often the way grief does, worrying about their family members, worrying about themselves getting sick, and they're very susceptible to getting sick in these institutions. And they watch the news and they see what's going on in their communities. It's triggering a lot of feelings, especially among communities of color who firsthand have experienced brutality for all their lives. And so it's just bringing up so much stuff we need to be aware of. And so we need to deal with our own reactions to this, our own grief, our own loss, so that we can be effective ministers.
And one of the questions talks about the journaling and the questions around COVID. And if you look at the journal questions that I posted, there are some that deal with that in there. And you can add your own, just talking about what are some of the losses that you've experienced at this time, and what is this calling you to do? And so again, we've posted them in the chat box, and
Yes.
you can use those.
Thank you. Just in closing, I would like to mention that our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, July 15th. It'll be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And it will be, our hosts will be Heather Rice-Minnis from Prison Fellowship and Dr. Mike Carrata from the American Bible Society. And I did not write down the topic. So as soon as I get that, I'll mention what that is. But just please note, we'll have that on our website as well. But that's Wednesday, July 15th, Eastern Time. So I'd like to thank both of our panelists, Catalina Connealy-Salazar and Chris Schwartz, for your time, for excellent presentation. Thank you for your preparation, and most especially thank you for your work and your witness.
I just say I've been doing prison ministry since 1978. I know I don't look it, over 40 years. And I'm as excited about going back in when COVID's over as I was when I was 18 and I first entered. I love this ministry. And I just pray for all of you out there that it be your passion, and that if you ever feel that it's a little overwhelming or you're burning out, know when to draw back, know when to take time off, and let it be the Lord's work.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to Karen, I just got a message that the topic for the next webinar on July 15th will be ministering to and working with people of other faith groups, which is really important in the prison setting. So please join us for the next webinar on Wednesday, July 15th. And Chris, would you like any last parting words?
I guess not, other than to say that I really do. I'm thankful every day for prison ministry, and I'm anxious to get back. And I will tell you this, that it seems like the money that we apply to various projects are always, we put prison ministry and the safety of our prisoners at the bottom of our list. And I'm really anxious to get back in to see how they're faring. I know that I've talked to several inmates on the phone, and the idea that they're telling me is that they're locked down 23 hours a day. And so I don't know about you, but if I were, you know, if there's only one television in there and you have to get into the general room to watch the TV, and you only get to watch for an hour a day, and that's also your time for recreation, I suspect that those people are really suffering right now. So keep them in your prayers.
Yes, that's a good point. Really, they're experiencing trauma now. And so when we do
Yes.
get back in, we will, part of our work will be helping them with that, as well as ourselves. We're all being traumatized with this, but the prisoners especially. So thank you both again so much for your presentation. And thank you all our participants. God bless you. And we'll see you again on July 15th, God willing.
Thank you, Father George.
Thank you.